In 1938, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring declares, "I completely lack the bombers capable of round-trip flights to New York with a 5-ton bomb load. I would be extremely happy to possess such a bomber, which would at last stuff the mouth of arrogance across the sea." 4 years after that statement is made, the nation of Germany begins to feel the industrial strength of America firsthand. Bombers begin pounding the Nazi regime day after day with attacks from England. With the United States' means of production out of reach, any hope of retaliation seems impossible. Little do American leaders know that 3 planes are being developed in order to do just that. Messerschmitt 264, Junkers 390, and Focke-Wulf TA-400 are being rushed into production to make it across the Atlantic in order to reciprocate this destruction. It is a project cloaked in secrecy for more than 70 years. Many details are sketchy, based on hearsay and unsubstantiated claims. Now take an in-depth look at both the planes and the possibilities they represented. Could they have tipped the scale in favor of the Axis so late in the war? Could they have actually made it across the ocean and back without refueling? Explore alongside historians and experts the story of the Amerikabombers. On December the 11th, 1941, Hitler declares war against the United States of America. Ever since the Second World War has begun, the two nations have been battling it out unofficially in the Atlantic Ocean.
Hitler probably declares war on the United States because there's already an undeclared war going on against the United States of America. In the North Atlantic, with U.S. destroyers, U-boats. So he may think it's simply inevitable. But whether he thinks it's inevitable or not, it probably wasn't, and it's a terrible mistake on his part.
We came in the war because of the Japanese, because of Hitler's stupid agreement with the Japanese. And he lived up to his agreement, but it really did cost him the war. You know, if he'd never made the alliance with Japan, you know, we might be doing this interview in German.
Before Pearl Harbor, America supplies the Allies with war materials, causing its ships and German U-boats to clash as a result.
It is quite clear that the United States had broken their neutrality at least 6 months before Pearl Harbor by assisting the British in getting the convoys from the United States to Britain safely and without being attacked by German submarines. So there was actually this warlike activity already in existence between American destroyers and German submarines without there being a public state of war.
Just prior to Pearl Harbor, there are a series of incidents in the North Atlantic. 3 destroyers are involved in altercations with German U-boats. The Greer, the Kearney, and the Reuben James. And there's an escalation with each one. And with the Kearney, it's merely an exchange of fire. There's a torpedo fired at the Greer after a U.S. plane takes a shot at the submarine. With the Kearney, the ship is actually hit with a loss of U.S. life. And with the Reuben James, that is sunk. And Roosevelt points to this as a reason for increased vigilance and activity against the Nazis. And it's a question of who fires first and all that.
For Hitler, the decision is an easy one. The United States will no longer be considered neutral. The gloves can finally come off. Its shipping capabilities are now fair game for German submarines. Once victory is declared over the Soviet Union, America and Britain will sue for peace. That is the Nazi plan. In less than a year, however, the exact opposite happens. Fighting against both Japan and Germany, the arsenal of democracy only grows stronger.
The Americans, again, had the resources, they had the industry, they had the time, and this huge industry that could produce trainers, fighters, light bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, patrol bombers, any type of aircraft you can think of, and the tanks. and the trucks, and produce the gasoline, and the munitions, and everything else, and the ships. Huge navy. They could do all of that at the same time. The Germans couldn't.
Factories begin turning out a plane every 5 minutes and a ship every day.
American factories were in 24/7 production by the end of 1942, and in 43 and 44 not only armed one of the largest militaries in the world, but armed our allies as well, the British, the Soviet Union. In the course of the war, we gave somewhere around 50,000 trucks to the Soviet Union, 15,000 tanks, 7,000 aircraft.
The United States has a unique advantage due to its geography. It does not have to worry about planes bombing their factories. It can go on producing at an unprecedented level.
America never really gets out of the Great Depression until World War II comes along. The unemployment figures were as high as 17% in the late 1930s, and they really don't start to drop until America becomes the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain and the Allies and shipping literally billions of dollars overseas. The Lend-Lease program ultimately is $50 billion by itself, which in the dollars of today is about $800 billion, a tremendous stimulus package for the American economy.
They were delivering huge numbers of aircraft and tanks, and vehicles, trucks, etc. to the British and the Canadians and the Australians, etc. So they were a major producer of weapons for the Allies.
And having two oceans protecting its civilian population, the American people are confident that they're providing materials that will shift the balance of power away from the Axis.
Economists say the natural resources of the United Nations are greater, but the capacity of the Axis to turn what resources they have into weapons of war is tremendous. They have the mighty Krupp munitions works. We have Birmingham. They have Skoda. We have Delaware. They have factories like this in occupied France. England has Vickers. They seized the steel mills of Luxembourg. We have Pittsburgh. They have great factories to turn out Heinkels, Messerschmitts, Dorniers. We turn out flying fortresses, P-38s, P-40s, Aerocobras, Tomahawks, many others. Romanian oil drives their planes and tanks. Oil from the fields of Oklahoma, Texas, and California will drive our planes and tanks.
For German leaders, the United States poses a serious dilemma. With more than 5,000 miles separating the two countries, no existing German aircraft can even come close to reaching America's east coast. In early 1942, the only strategy available to Nazi war planners is unrestricted submarine warfare.
One of the most successful weapons that the Nazis had was the U-boat fleet, the U-boat service, the Kriegsmarine, which is essentially, by the end of the war, a U-boat navy. They were in 1942. They were wildly successful. It looked like they were going to just win the war just by sinking everything in the Atlantic.
A plan known as Operation Drumbeat begins with U-boats torpedoing America's shores, sinking millions of tons of shipping.
Well, the Americans, of course, were very much surprised by the immediate reaction or action, not reaction, by German submarines after the war has been declared by Germany. Germany at that particular time sent a group of submarines over to the American coast, and America was totally unprepared for that kind of assault. And the German submarines over there found absolutely no opposition whatsoever, and it was partly a Turkish shoot for them. The ships were illuminated; they were not in convoys. The cities were not blacked out, so it was partly for them almost a peacetime-like exercise they did, and of course they were very, very successful in doing so, and put America into a state of shock from which it took them many, many months to recover.
Operation Drumbeat, or Paukenschlag in the original German, was the first U-boat offensive against the east coast of the United States. And to say that it was a happy time for the U-boats and their crews is understating the case considerably. And in fact, many of them did look back on it as those who survived the war look back on 1942 as just kind of a happy hunting time. It takes all modern nations some time to gear up into a war posture, and it might take democracies longer than dictatorships, and it might take our fractious and argumentative democracy in America even longer than some. And certainly the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and we were at war a couple of days later, but it's not to say we took it with the seriousness that it deserved. And something as simple as blacking out cities on the East Coast was policies and procedures would have to be drawn up. It's not simply a case of everyone in New York turning out their lights at the same time. Now, with illuminated cities along the East Coast, every single American transport which sailed from harbor was nicely silhouetted against a bright background of lights. And U-boat and submarine commanders just could not have had a juicier or more lucrative target. And these experienced crews took advantage of it, sinking somewhere around 2 million tons of shipping in 1942.
Caught off guard, it takes time for American war planners to augment their strategy in dealing with this submarine menace. Through the use of a convoy system, as well as ordering mandatory blackouts, Operation Drumbeat fades away.
The turning point can be placed at early 1943, in May, I think, when we lost about 40 boats in 1 month or something like that.
By 1943, materials and supplies begin reaching Britain with little interruption. Once on English soil, their impact is felt immediately. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators begin flying over the heart of Germany. Alongside British planes, the fatherland is bombed mercilessly.
The offensive continues in greater and greater strength.
Well, certainly German industries took a pounding. German civilians took a pounding. Winston Churchill probably put it best when he once said that the air effort was dehousing the German people, destroying their living quarters one building at a time.
Cities are turned into rubble. And with Soviet victories on the Eastern Front, the Allied powers begin closing in on the Axis. Hitler, seeing the destruction firsthand, is outraged at these bombings. However, with his U-boats neutralized and the United States out of reach, there's little Nazi generals can do to fight back against the American war machine. What is needed is a wonder weapon to enact revenge. Beginning as early as the interwar period, German war planners study a hypothetical attack on the United States.
Dornberger, assisted by Werner von Braun, had been thinking about some kind of a rocket-propelled weapon that could attack the United States as far back as 1937. There was a weapon that they were designing called variously either the New York bomb or the American rocket. It had an interesting intent. They would take a massive booster rocket, put a V2 at the top of it, fire it off, and the V2 would eventually attain speeds of 6,000 miles an hour, which meant that it could cross the Atlantic in something like 40 minutes. It could strike New York, it could strike Washington, it could strike Boston.
Of course, you can never laugh these things off because Germans were so innovative that sometimes they achieved things which to many minds were quite impossible.
The Germans were never able to launch any sort of attack on the continental United States. That's not to say they didn't talk about it, they didn't plan on doing it, and they didn't drop various schemes for doing it, some relatively realistic and some much more fanciful.
Many concepts are examined and many are rejected due to their technological limitations.
There was the notion, for example, of launching a V-1, the so-called buzz bomb, in some ways the distant ancestor of our modern cruise missile, of launching a V-1 from a ramp on the deck of a U-boat that had surfaced off of the American coast. Now, of course, the problem of getting a German U-boat to the American coast with a large ramp and a buzz bomb on top of it was never really dealt with.
Some of these ideas even border on the realm of a science fiction novel.
Likewise, there was a plan for towing a V2. Now, the V2 being the not-so-distant ancestor of the post-World War II intercontinental ballistic missile, of taking a V2, encasing it in its own missile launcher, and then putting it into position on the back of a U-boat. The launcher would swing into a vertical position, that is a launch position, and thus then launch the weapon against an American city, presumably New York, and presumably Manhattan. Now, the problems with such a plan, of course, include getting, once again, that V2 over the Atlantic Ocean, crawling with U.S. naval vessels of various shapes and sizes, not to mention our own submarine fleet, and doing so while trailing an extremely heavy and extremely obvious 118-foot-long canister without being detected.
The most realistic and achievable weapon is a long-range bomber.
In 1939, things in Europe were not going too well, and war clouds were beginning to erupt. It was then that Hitler realized, and some of the hierarchy in the Luftwaffe realized, that they may need something that could fly a little bit further than what they originally conceived. So they put out a specification to try and get a bomber that might reach the United States.
Attacking the American East Coast with raids the same way the B-17 is attacking the fatherland.
The Germans were very intent on finding some way that they could strike the United States by air. Besides having worked on rocketry, they were also developing a bomber.
So the Germans realized that at one point, if you wanted to stop or at least put a brake on the production effort in the US, you would have to put some threat over their head. The only way to do that would be to bomb them.
Unfortunately for the Nazis, it's a goal that's difficult at best. For a plan like this to work, it must reach America and back without refueling.
The problem that the Germans faced in building a long-range bomber is long-range. It had to go across the Atlantic, bomb New York City, maybe a little slack time there in case they ran into some fighters or something, and then it had to turn around nonstop without landing and fly back to Norway or the west coast of France. Which this is a long trip, and nobody does this today. Your 747 doesn't do this today. They'll land in Europe or in England and refuel and check the plane out. They couldn't do this. The Germans couldn't do this. They had no way to land. So if you're going to do this in a round-trip fashion, you have to have a truly intercontinental bomber. And this is something the United States didn't have until the B-36, which was 1949, 1950.
Their best chance is with the Bollemann Voss 222 flying boat. But the odds of it making it back to the fatherland are slim to none.
Well, I flew the 222, and I would certainly agree it could get to within range of the American coast. It was a pretty impressive flying boat. I do not believe that they could ever have attacked the American coast and got away with it, because though it had this tremendous range, and it was nice, quite nice to fly, got a quite light handling controls, it was very vulnerable to a fighter attack. And I just don't see it surviving any attack by any fighter at all, frankly.
12,000 miles would be needed in order to strike. No plane during this time can even come close in covering a distance this size. The Germans' longest-range bomber, the Heinkel 177, is encountering numerous problems with its unworkable tandem engine arrangement.
They didn't really get around to building 4-engine bombers, and when they did, it was an off and on type of thing. So one general actually was fired over this idea that he didn't come up with a 4-engine bomber later on in the war, Ernst Udet. He was marginalized and then committed suicide, probably over this very issue.
A plane of this magnitude must instead be designed from scratch.
But they realized it would have to be a very long-range bomber. For all intended purposes, you're looking at the German equivalent of the B-29.
And in order for it to work, an enormous amount of time and material is needed for production, development and testing, something the Germans are lacking by this time.
There were lies about the stocks of aluminium available. Production had not been rationalized, civilian resources had not been mobilized, and there was still a belief on the part of fighter pilots that quality was what mattered and that you would only get that by producing aircraft in relatively small numbers. So mass production was avoided. In 1944, Britain alone had 12 factories that employed more than 10,000 people. Germany only had 2.
Despite these roadblocks, Adolf Hitler, having a fascination with wonder weapons, enthusiastically gives a green light to the project. The Amerikabombers are born. To provide a buffer of relief, Nazi planners believe they have a perfect halfway point. The Azores, an archipelago of 9 islands located 900 miles east off neutral Portugal, is ideal for a project of this nature.
Now they realized that the distances were huge. Actually, that's why they considered using the Azores as a base. It's halfway across, not quite halfway across the Atlantic, but it's certainly closer than bombing from bases in France. So there was definitely an interest there.
In 1940, after the fall of France, Admiral Raeder strongly urged Hitler to occupy them before the Americans could get to the islands first.
At one time, it was speculated, even Hitler suggested, that perhaps they should invade the Azores and take over the Azores and use it as a jumping off point for their long-range aircraft to fly to the States.
Now, if German planes are given permission to land the same way German U-boats are allowed to dock, this geostrategic area would be worth its weight in gold. Having the range requirements significantly reduced, the plan to bomb America now appears more feasible than ever. What is needed now are targets. In order to cripple the arsenal of democracy, these hypothetical German planes cannot just bomb indiscriminately. They instead must go right after their means of production, attacking factories that are building the planes and bombs that are ruining German cities. Prepared by the War Department in April of 1942, a 33-page document lists 21 potential targets for the Germans to attack. The Aluminum Company of America, located in Messina, New York. The Chrysler Corporation in Detroit. The Wright Aeronautical Company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and many others are the destinations for the Amerikabombers. The targets and the takeoff are set. In looking for companies to build these superbombers, the Nazi regime goes to the very best.
They came up with some designs. Every builder would come up with, every aircraft manufacturer would come up with a design, and they would take a look at the designs on paper and select one.
Messerschmitt, makers of the Me-109 and the 110, 2 planes that battled Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. It's also the company that's working on the revolutionary Me-262, the first jet-powered aircraft. Beginning in the late 1930s, Messerschmitt begins dabbling in what is known as Secret Project P-1061. Its requirements are for an aircraft capable of reaching bases in Central Africa as well as Vichy French territories. Now, the plan calls for a plane that can reach the United States, carrying a payload of 5,000 kilograms.
Messerschmitt came up with an idea that got off the ground, the Messerschmitt 264, and they originally wanted something like 6 prototypes for testing. And if these were proved successful, then they were going to build a fleet of them.
Awarded the contract by the German government, workers at Messerschmitt begin working on the aircraft known as the Me-264. Different versions are considered, and once the plane begins taking shape, it starts to look eerily similar to another design that's being constructed across the ocean.
So by and large, there were designs. I think there was a Messerschmitt 264, which looks a little bit like a B-29.
The 264 was actually quite an interesting aeroplane design. It had a circular fuselage section, which in stress terms was very, very good, because the circle has equal stress points. It was built over a long period of time, and it didn't actually fly until 1942.
Originally designed with 4 BMW 801G engines, German officials hope that a 6-engine version will be in the skies as early as the fall of 1943. However, designers are noticing that the first prototype of the aircraft has a very high wing load. This is resulting in a loss of maneuverability, an unimpressive climb rate, and in-flight instability. 2 more prototypes are to be tested, one with armaments and one that is to be fully completed. However, with the aircraft being years away from flying, alternative designs and designers are sought out. Junkers, makers of the Stuka dive bomber and the Ju-52 transport plane, present their vision of a transoceanic aircraft capable of bombing Uncle Sam. The company is highly favoured amongst top Luftwaffe officials when it's taken over by the government in 1935, following the death of its founder, Hugo Junkers. Having overseen the company's nationalisation personally, Field Marshal Erhard Milch leans towards the alternative. One of their planes already on the books is the Ju-290, an evolution of an earlier design with a greater wingspan, used for long-range maritime reconnaissance and bringing supplies to German soldiers, most notably during their encirclement at Stalingrad.
The 290 had the advantage of having a roll-on, roll-off capacity for equipment, because it had a rear door that could be dropped. And that was the big advantage. You didn't need to have trucks to load it and unload it. You could actually drive on and drive off. And that was the major advantage of the 290.
The train of thought now is to just enlarge this aircraft for bombing America. The result is the Ju-390, a plane with 6 1700 horsepower engines, a wingspan of 181 feet, and a fuselage that is even longer than the American B-29.
Junkers were actually adapting their Ju-290 aircraft into the Ju-390, which was actually a 6-engined aircraft. And a lot of people, especially the German Navy, thought that would be quite a nice aeroplane, and others thought that yes, it would make a very nice Amerikabomber.
The Ju-390 was a similar situation. There were 2 built that we know of. One was given to Hans Bauer, the Hitler's pilot. So it was for Hitler's use, for state use. So Hitler had a 390.
Built at the Junkers factory in Dessau, the first prototype is able to make its maiden flight in August of 1943.
They had high hopes for this bomber, and between this and the Messerschmitt 264, it looks like that much time, or if not in total time, these were controlled by the SS.
Despite its early success, the Nazi hierarchy still wants an insurance policy. On August the 11th, 1938, the nation of Germany makes history when a Focke-Wulf Condor arrives in New York City after a rigorous 24-hour flight across the Atlantic.
There was still this belief in the USA that they were very safe, and isolationism was still very, very rife there, and that any kind of invasion from abroad would have been almost impossible. However, in 1938 an event occurred which changed all that. This was that on the 10th of August 1938, a Focke-Wulf 200 took off from Berlin-Staaken and flew right across the Atlantic and landed at Floyd Bennett Field in New York after a 24-hour, 59-minute flight, non-stop. This put the wind up senior military people who suddenly realised that they weren't quite as safe as they thought.
Having proved itself capable of flying long distances, the aircraft goes to work during the war, providing reconnaissance for U-boat operations.
The Focke-Wulf 200, it was of course the civil Condor at one stage, and then it was militarized to become the Courier. And in fact, as the Courier, it was very successful as a reconnaissance aircraft over the Atlantic. It was very heavily armed, and it had a wide range, and where it did the damage was it could operate beyond fighter range from England or from Britain.
Now, the plan is to evolve the Condor the same way that the 290 is being evolved. The result is the TA-400, consisting of 6 BMW 1700 horsepower engines. Just to keep this monster up in the air, an unprecedented 32 fuel tanks, capable of carrying 7,000 gallons of gasoline, are put on board the aircraft. Possessing a pressurized cockpit, 2 remote-controlled turrets, 20mm cannons, and a payload of 22,000 pounds. The third of the Amerikabombers appears to be the deadliest. As Germany struggles to find a way to attack the United States, many options are looked at. Submarines, space rockets, and espionage are appealing, but the most realistic strategy by 1942 is a long-range bomber. 3 companies, Messerschmitt Junkers and Focke-Wulf, all bring their designs to the table and begin working on planes that can render a decisive blow against America.
Russia did not actually capitulate. And in the winter of 1941, it actually launched a counterattack in front of Moscow. And there began a phase of the war which was to last more or less till its end. It was a war of attrition, a war eventually to be on 2 fronts, precisely the war the Germans always knew they couldn't win.
By 1944, the tide has turned in favor of the Allies.
Beginning in 1943, the American Air Force and the RAF, the British Air Force, were mounting 1,000-plane raids against Germany. By 1944, these raids were creating havoc in Germany. 3 raids against the city of Hamburg resulted in something like 50,000 German dead. The cities in Germany were being destroyed, leveled at the rate of something like 2 a month.
While the principles of war remained unchanged, the use of new weapons revised the concept of war. This time, Germany was faced with a weapon that leaped over battle lines and frontiers and smashed at the ultimate enemy, the German worker, who equipped and fed the German soldier. This time, the enemy nation was physically destroyed before its defending army was defeated.
But as the Allies came to rely increasingly on a strategy of strategic air power as a way of bringing Germany low, the need became pressing for some sort of escort fighter, and of course that need was met in the P-51.
The P-38 was available at first, then the P-47. Neither had the range to be able to escort the bombers all the way from England to Germany and back. The P-51 was the first that could do that. So now you had bombers flying raids all the way into the heart of Germany, even as far as Berlin, being able to have a very effective fighter escort the whole way there and back.
In England, Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, is being planned by both British and American generals for later that year.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied Tactical Aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters so far. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by them. So, I mean, you know, it had a huge effect, I think, on the whole course of the war, of being able to bring the fight directly to the German tactical aviation forces.
For a Germany in its last throes, they begin turning to the secret weapons they have invested so much time and money into as the saviors that can strike a knockout blow.
The Holy Grail was a weapon of mass destruction. And They had gone the road of the nuclear, hoping to get the nuclear bomb. They had gone the road of the V1 and the V2. But they were always, as I say, searching for that Holy Grail.
August of 1944, Hitler and Mussolini met in Germany. Mussolini took a train to Germany, and they had a little heart-to-heart talk. Mussolini said to Hitler, "Look, I've been deposed once. I've been reinstalled in northern Italy. The Allies are in Italy. The Allies are closing in. The Russians are closing in from the east. It's August of 1944, and what guarantee do I have if I still throw in my cards with you, Adolf Hitler, that you can actually pull this war out? Because it's not looking good now." And Hitler said to Mussolini in so many words, "I have some wonder weapons coming."
In Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe is working overtime, getting the V1 flying bomb ready to launch. And if this device fails, the revolutionary V2 rocket is going to strike the fear of God into the Allies, being the predecessor of today's intercontinental ballistic missile.
The V1 and the V2 were extremely important in terms of later weapons development. The V2, of course, a single glance at it will make clear that it is the ancestor of the later ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. But perhaps even more than that for most Americans, it is clearly the ancestor of our NASA effort to reach space.
The target for both these weapons is London, where no one will be spared. Britain's ally, the United States, is also set to receive a deadly dose of a different type of wonder weapon.
The Americans were using Great Britain as an aircraft carrier to bomb Germany. Bombing England or bombing London alone, the British may have said no more, but there's no guarantee that the Americans were even going to let them do that at this point. They were so intent upon crushing Germany, and they had the Russians moving in from the east. So for a lot of political reasons, you have to stop this at the source. So the Germans were interested in bombing New York City, number 1, Moscow, number 2, and London, number 3.
In order to strike fear across the Atlantic, the Amerikabombers are being hurried along. As development continues, the Nazi leadership is hoping to get at least one of these planes across the ocean to deliver a fatal blow.
The Junker 390, which was tested in a flight that managed to remain aloft for something like 12,000 miles, which would easily have made a round trip to the United States. And one of the practice runs they ran within 12 miles of the U.S. coast. The Germans even had another bomber in their plans, and that was a Messerschmitt plane, the NE-264. It was also tested and very likely could have struck the United States.
If this plan proves successful, the psychological impact could be the German equivalent of the Doolittle raid.
Yeah, the targets for the ME-264 would obviously have been preferred to be military targets. But the propaganda value of simply dropping a few bombs on New York would have had an amazing effect, both in the USA and on the morale in Germany. In the USA, it would have no doubt caused a lot of panic and created a lot of defensive maneuvers within the East Coast because they didn't know if and when the bombers could come back.
In bombing the United States, the Germans saw that they could politically damage the United States, damage the American leadership so much that the Americans would reconsider their quest for total victory. That, in other words, that the Germans could do a deal. The Germans could do an armistice on the Western Front and perhaps keep fighting the Soviets. They really didn't like the Soviets. The Americans and the British they didn't, that wasn't part of the bargain when they started the war. They really didn't, they looked upon us as more of a nuisance that got to festered and became a huge problem for them. So they would have always liked to just do away with us and continue fighting the Soviets.
As intelligence leaks, President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill begin to worry about the secret weapons Germany might have in store for them.
Franklin Roosevelt was very conscious of the capacity of German science. And indeed, in 1944, in December of that year, one of his agents who was posted in Turkey, which was a hotbed of international espionage, reported to him that the Germans had mastered another weapon called the V3, and that it was capable of attacking the United States. Now, Roosevelt took this threat seriously. In fact, he confided to one of his people that he understood that a single bomb launched in this method could destroy a United States city. So he put the East Coast on alert when this attack presumably was going to happen. Obviously, it did not occur, but it pointed out the potential of German science.
If resources are diverted, England will be softened up for the eventual launchings of the V1 and the V2. The only thing that Germany does not have on its side is time. By 1944, as the Amerikabombers are being developed, Germany remains in a weakened state. Being pounded into submission day and night by Allied planes taking off from the coast of England, and with the Soviet Union moving in from the east, it's no longer an if, but when the Nazis will surrender. Their factories cannot continue unless a dramatic reversal of fortune occurs. Only a miracle weapon can save them, which along with the V1 and the V2 is hopefully the planes designed to pulverize Uncle Sam. However, just as the project begins to develop, the dominoes begin to fall, lessening the chances that one of these planes will make it up into the skies before it's too late. The first of these is the decision by the Portuguese government to lease the Azores bases to the Allies. Sensing which direction the war is going in, the neutral nation turns away from the German plan to launch the Amerikabombers from their territory. This key strategic site, where the Third Reich planned to base these planes, is now only a distant memory. As German cities and industries crumble, Luftwaffe officials are forced to make drastic cuts. In many respects, the Amerikabombers are typical of the hundreds of secret projects being mismanaged that become the Achilles heel of the Luftwaffe.
Right up to the last day of the war, they were working on 138 different guided missile projects. How can a nation which is on its knees be expending effort like this? Fortunately for us, they were expending this sort of effort through total mismanagement and lack of control of their resources.
And one of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended. This took place throughout the war, compared to, for example, U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
Only 3 Me-264s had actually been ordered, out of which only 1 was realized, and the other 2 were still in small parts, and nothing really serious was taking place there. And then out the blue, the RLM, the German Air Ministry, asked if they could produce 30 Me-264s. But then everybody realized that where would they build them, how would they build them, and from what would they build them? It was really the boat had been missed on any of that.
The resources, the time, the crews, the ground support equipment, the bases, because you can't base aircraft of that size on a grass field. You need all the infrastructure. You have to get the bombs to the base. You have to get the fuel to the base, and not just once. You have to get the fuel coming back constantly, day after day after day. It's a huge infrastructure that the Americans and the British had to put up in Great Britain. The UK was a giant service station. These hundreds, thousands of aircraft had to be refueled constantly. That infrastructure did not exist in occupied Europe for a large bomber force. Because sending 2 aircraft every week, what's the point?
With resources strained, planes still in their design stage are now in the crosshairs. One aircraft that's on the chopping block is Focke-Wulf's TA-400. After assessing its design and noticing it requires more labour and materials than the Me-264, the decision to cancel it is made in late 1943.
They investigated and then realised that to actually build it and make it fly would take so many years that it was just impractical to even consider the project as being feasible.
Even as the prototype of the Ju-390 proves to be feasible, by mid-1944 all orders of that plane and the 290 are cancelled.
Again, it would have taken a vast amount of space and material and everything to build. And it really, the performance of the 390 didn't come up to what was expected. So that idea didn't go any further, although the German Navy quite liked the aeroplane.
Now, the only hope is with Messerschmitt.
One was destroyed on the ground. The program was canceled, as all German programs were. It's a start-stop attitude. So it may have been started and stopped several times.
Because of the changing situation of the war, and people had lots of ideas for strategic bombing. One day they were for it, the next day they were against it, and specifications were sort of being issued left, right and centre. Messerschmitt actually did produce a large number of projected modifications to his 264, but none of them ever came to any fruition. I mean, there were ideas to attach huge fuel tanks to the airplanes, which could be 600-gallon fuel tanks carried externally. Also, a 6-engine version was proposed. But all this was real pie-in-the-sky stuff, because none of it could really be achieved at that time of the war. Things were really starting to go bad for Germany, and a lot of this stuff was just panic measures, trying to sort of clutch things out of the air, which really were just not possible.
With the continued bombardment causing a severe strain on the country's resources, Erhard Milch decides to stall production of the 264 and instead focus on the 262. The priority now is defence, and the hope is that this jet fighter bomber can shoot down the flying fortresses that have been pounding them into submission. That same year, several Allied bombing raids on the Messerschmitt factories damage all of the 264s beyond repair. By October of that year, the aircraft is cancelled indefinitely. All of these factors combined spell doom for the Amerikabombers.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
In the more than 60 years since the Nazi regime was destroyed, many questions surrounding the Amerikabombers program remain unsolved.
When we interrogated William Messerschmitt, he pooh-poohed it as if, I really had nothing to do with it. I think they realized they were going down a blind alley with that, really.
For a project cloaked in secrecy, rampant rumours begin spreading in the decades following VE Day. One such rumour is the assertion that the Ju-390 successfully made a reconnaissance flight of approximately 12,000 miles from occupied France to New York Harbor.
The fact that Juncker's Ju-390 came within 12 miles of New York is something that's said by many sources. It's not just one source. This isn't a wild and crazy guy saying this. This is something that is said and repeated, and I believe to be true.
A hypothetical question asked is, what impact would these planes have had if they were successful in carrying out bombing raids on American cities.
But I would say that even if the Germans could have put 2 or 3 aircraft together that could somehow make that perilous flight across the Atlantic and lob a couple of bombs into lower Manhattan, I think the political impact would have been tremendous. At the very least, President Roosevelt would have been forced to redeploy anti-aircraft assets from Britain, where they were protecting Britain against German air attack, to the continental United States. And that might have had some appreciable impact on the future course of operations in Western Europe.
If the United States had actually suffered on its shores serious damage from German rocketry or from other transoceanic bombers such as they intended, the probably impact on the war would be that it would have been extended. Given the great industrial, innovative powers of the United States as demonstrated in that war by our production, the development of an atom bomb, no doubt we would have struck back, but it certainly would have extended the war to have the destruction brought to our shores.
I wouldn't say a waste of resources, but to a large extent, the hopes of actually curtailing, even annoying the Americans was very small. They might have annoyed them all right, but that would not have been good because the Americans might simply have reacted by bombing the German factories and the bases more fiercely than they did. So in the end, chances are, even that the Germans built the bombers and the bases, they would not have remained in operation very long. They may not even have been completed before they got pulverized.
Would they have been able to crack the well-oiled American war machine by 1945? Would they have been able to weaken civilian morale?
When you look at the effect of the German bombing of England during the Blitz, it's pretty clear it strengthened British resolve. It caused more of a feeling of we've got to get back at those guys rather than fomenting this attitude of, oh, there's no point, we should surrender. So if you're talking about strategic bombing as trying to sap the morale of the enemy, the evidence is pretty clear that doesn't work.
Naturally, the American people probably felt very secure having an entire ocean between ourselves and the war that was raging in Europe. What effect, let's say, on morale would have occurred had the Germans been able to strike us directly? I think it would have been very likely the parallel with London and Berlin. These places were smashed. Berlin was practically reduced to rubble by 1,000-plane raids, but people kept their chins up. They managed to take it and went on from day to day. I don't believe that the American people would have reacted anyway differently.
It's very difficult for people who have not been involved in a war like that, or have not gone through the experience, to understand that war to us had become a condition which to us was no more different than the weather. It was something we had to live with. You could talk about it, but you couldn't do a darn thing about it. And the fact that cities got destroyed or submarines got sunk or whatever, it was just part of war. And we took it very naturally somehow without being as dismayed as we are today when we read history.
The plan to bomb America proved appealing to many in the High Command, an act of revenge against a nation that seemed impregnable. Like many other secret Nazi projects, however, a firm lack of purpose and direction existed. The bureaucracy in place at the time and the continued destruction of German factories and cities guaranteed that aircraft like these, despite their potential, would never get off the ground. Instead, these planes and the men behind them remain a pipe dream, one of the Second World War's greatest what-ifs.
Know your enemy, an enemy strong in arms and fierce in his attack. Yet perhaps the greatest myth of modern times has been the German's belief in the invincibility of his air fleet.
time has shown that a quality of suspicious alertness, coupled with a sound knowledge of the enemy, has upon occasion wrecked and blasted him from the skies. Yet the white cliffs of Dover no longer form a bastion to the foe. And so we bring you shots of the German Luftwaffe in action and examples of their more usual types of aircraft, so that you may carry away a general impression of the enemy in your mind's eye, that you may know him the moment you see him, jump to it and bring him crashing down to earth in the sure knowledge of his identity. Up goes the curtain on one of the most distinctive of all enemy planes, the Henschel 126. Automatically we compare it with our own Lysander, but once you know the difference, you'll wonder you didn't spot it before. They are very different in point of fact. Whereas the Lysander is short and stubby, has a glazed cockpit flush with the upper line of the fuselage, you can see it opened here, and wings which appear to be swept forward, the Henschel is much longer and slimmer in appearance. Its tailplane is set high and braced. Its glazed cockpit does not flow with the top line of its fuselage. And most important difference of all, its wings are swept backwards, as if it was some huge and rather clumsy bird. Deep V-shaped cuts at wing roots between fuselage and trailing edge are yet more conclusive proof that this is the Henschel 126. These high-wing monoplanes, with some 200 miles an hour only to boast of, have neither the armament nor the performance of their counterpart the Lysander. But like it, they are used for reconnaissance and for cooperation with the German army. Now to the fighters, in this case the Me-109. I expect you've all thought at one time or another that one fighter is almost exactly like the next. Actually, they're very different indeed. For a start, have a look at that very squat tail fin and rudder. We've nothing like it. And you can see how the tailplane is placed, cutting the tail fin in half and braced by a strut. There's that tailplane again. And now there's something else beginning to show, the straight lines of the leading and trailing edges, and the squared-off wingtips. We'll see them better in plan view when we come to it. And in plan view, the problem is solved. Look out for slimness and length of fuselage compared with wingspan, straight leading and trailing edges, and squared-off wingtips. These proclaim it as the Me-109. When diving at you, the Me-109 is easily recognizable by the two radiators, one under each wing, and again the very high tailplane, complete with its struts. This is Germany's standard single-seater fighter, and is used apart from fighter defense for low-flying attacks on ground troops. But with its fixed machine guns, its effectiveness in ground strapping is somewhat reduced. It has been known to carry a very restricted bomb load, but only for the purpose of tip-and-run bombing raids, where speed is calculated to elude the defense. 350 miles an hour, some 30 miles an hour slower than our little Spitfire, and certainly very much outgunned. And here is his big brother. Don't be misled by that heavy bomber look. He's the Me-110, and a fighter first and foremost. Even at this angle, you can see the nose projecting forward in front of the twin engines, and the twin tail fins, which give it that heavy bomber look. The Me-110 also has a very distinctive cockpit, placed well back in line with the wings and built up on top of the fuselage. You'll notice as well the considerable span of wing and tailplane. and those very square wingtips. Here again the most noticeable points are the wide and tapering wings and wide tailplane. And once more the nose which leads the engines, though not so much as in the case of the Dornier, we shall see shortly. And as she turns away, the sharp projecting nose between twin engines, the straight leading and trailing edges, and the squared-off wingtips stamp it as the ME-110. She's a two-seater fighter and is used principally for long-range bomber escort duties. Some 10 miles an hour faster than the 109, but like her, however, the 110 has been known to carry a bomb load, when high-flying bombing duties are called for and where accuracy is not essential. Her latest role appears to be the transport of high Nazi government officials who are easily recognizable from any angle by their trailing edges. The Ju-87B, the Stuka, Germany's dive bomber and also the most distinctive of her planes. Well, you shouldn't have any trouble with this little blighter. She looks rather like a round-shouldered vulture, complete with non-retractable undercarriage and spatted wheels. And a highly placed cockpit, which gives her that humpback look. The tail fin and rudder is also very much larger than that of the 109, so you can't confuse her with that one. Here again is that vulture-like appearance, as if she were hovering with claws extended, waiting to swoop down on her prey. Another prominent feature is the very large radiator. And you can begin to notice the cranked wings, which is the unmistakable mark of the Stuka. This is the only view of her which might possibly deceive, yet here there are very definite indications of identity. The almost pointed wingtips, the length of the nose, and the very wide squared-off tailplane. Here she comes, straight for you, and now there's no mistake about it. The cranked wings, the radiator, and the non-retractable undercarriage. This is the moment to let her have it, plumb in the nose. A two-seater dive bomber with a speed of 242, the Stuka's armament consists of 2 fixed machine guns, one in the crank of each wing, and a third, a movable one, in the aft cockpit. She carries in the center of her fuselage 1 large 1,000-pound bomb and 2 sticks of 100-pounders, 2 under each wing. The 1,000-pounder is attached to a cradle which lets down on release and throws the bomb clear of the air screw when the machine is in her dive. She's a handy little plane, all right, and Jerry's got a lot of them, but slow and very vulnerable indeed when small arms fire is steadfastly directed at her. If you attack her with determination, you'll certainly come off best. Make no mistake about that. She's got the looks of a sticky enemy, and she's got the hell of a lot of noise about her. She may even use sirens to heighten the effect. But no one ever came to much harm from an evil look and a bit of a noise. Stand up to her, and you'll get her every time. Another Junkers plane which has been adapted for dive bombing is the Ju-88. The Ju-88, like the Stuka, has a large single tail fin, but there the likeness ends. It's a twin-engine machine and is clearly recognizable by the bulbous effect of its glazed nose. This is due to the forward position of the cockpit and the placing of this bomb aimer's position, which you'll see later is placed off-center. See also those air brakes, which are fitted to assist in its dive bombing duties. Another point which is now apparent is that the engines are exceptionally long and in line with the nose. Here the Ju-88 can be spotted right away without any argument by those engines. They are very long and square off with the nose in no uncertain manner. This close-up will clinch that little matter for good and all, won't it? One more outstanding detail, the projecting tail fin and rudder of the Ju-88. In its dive, the low-slung engines, as well as the offset bomb aimer's position, proclaim it for what it is. There's the external bomb stowage as well. 2 500-pounders on each side between engine and fuselage. The Ju-88 is the maid-of-all work of the German air fleet, with some 300 miles an hour to her credit and a crew of 4. Bit of a Christmas tree, this bird, with 6 movable machine guns dotted around. This is a long-range bomber and dive bomber, and has been employed in many attacks on convoys and shipping generally. Though one of the most successful of all German planes in use, it too is extremely vulnerable if met with determined small arms fire at the right moment. A brief glimpse at other Junkers, one you've seen before, the Ju-52, and Germany's main troop and paratroop carrying plane. Remember those 3 radial engines? That long, wide gap extending the whole length of the wing between aileron and trailing edge. The low wing structure. The non-retractable undercarriage. Those wide, straight-edged and tapering wings, and the width of the elevators, which extend beyond the tailplanes. These transport planes, as you'll remember, carry their quota of some 16 troops or a dozen paratroops who jump from 200 to 400 feet. Armament on the Ju-52 consists of at least 2 movable machine guns, one in a variable position and one poked out of the gents' cloakroom in the rear. Speed 170 miles an hour, slowing down to 90 when paratroops are to be dropped. And here comes the bomber class, in this case represented by the Heinkel 111. Although it has a single tail fin and engines in line with the nose like the Ju-88, those engines are very much shorter. The big thing to spot with this one is the unbroken curve of the top of the fuselage, from nose to tail fin. This definitely stamps it as the Heinkel 111. Have a look also at that gun position, placed halfway back under the fuselage. Three-quarter view, you can see the much shorter engines squared off with the nose. And that gun position, a very distinctive mark. Cutouts at the wing roots are also beginning to show. And with plan view, you've got the whole story all over again. Short engines, squared off with the nose, cutouts where the wings join the fuselage, and 2 new features, the sweep back of the wings and that definite oval shape of the tailplane. And as she flies away, remember cutouts at wing roots, oval tailplane, short engines in line with the nose, and Heinkel's your uncle. With 6 movable machine guns, a bomb load of 8 500-pounders, a speed of 274, and a crew of 5 or 6, this is the largest bomber Jerry has in normal use. Although many have been shot down by the RAF, Jerry still has a fair number of Heinkel 111. Now for the Dorniers. Here is the Do-17Z, sometimes known as the 215, and the latest of that particular brand of bomber. Now the first thing you'll spot with this one is that the plane has a bulbous nose. So had the Ju-88, but she had a single tail fin, whereas this one, exactly. So remember, bulbous nose and double tail fin makes it the DO-17Z. There's the bulbous nose and double tail fin again. And you can just start to spot other points of recognition. The way the engines appear to be slung under the wings, an effect caused by the high wing construction of the Dornier, and the way the wings flow into the fuselage, as if they'd been smoothed round into it. Remember also the long, slim lines of the fuselage, which gave to its predecessor the nickname Flying Pencil. This is yet another unmistakable mark of the Dornier. No doubt about it now, is there? Or is there? Although this was taken from above the plane, the outline remains the same. The long, slim body, the bulbous nose, the rounded-off wing roots. And here are a couple of new things. That lead of the nose in front of the engines, and the short wings with rounded tips. DO-17Z, all right. Like the Heinkel, the DO-17Z has 6 movable machine guns and a bomb load of 10 100-pounders. With a speed of up to 290, this is the long-range reconnaissance bomber of the Luftwaffe. Hello! Something's in the wind. She's off on a reconnaissance flight over enemy territory. Let's follow the fortunes of such an expedition and see what may result. Fitted with special cameras with high-powered lenses, which are placed in position in the fuselage, their job in a proposed attack or invasion is to fly high over enemy territory, photographing in series the area where attack is intended. When the photographs are finally assembled and oriented, they will form a mosaic of the whole area, giving up its secrets in the way of troop concentrations, defended works, aerodromes, and so on. Back comes the DO-17Z with its valuable load of information, and an expert staff stands by to receive the film pack, rush it to the developing apparatus, and thence to the illuminated panel, where the transparent positives are examined minutely against a light. Here then is the product of those high-powered lenses which probed your secrets from that plane in the sky you thought too high, perhaps, or too unworthy of your attention. The plot thickens. Word goes out, and the bombers, shedding their cloaks of invisibility, prepare for the first round. High-altitude bombing to disrupt communications, destroy aerodromes, break up troop concentrations, and create confusion in our midst. There goes the DO-17Z with the bulbous nose and the double tail fin, in its role as bomber this time. Those short, round-tipped wings and long, slim lines, DO-17Z. And here comes the Heinkel 111. There's that well-known unbroken line on top of fuselage, and the gun position under the center. And now those cutouts at wing roots, Heinkel 111. Last off, here's the Ju-88, with its bulbous nose and its single tail fin, and despite its smaller size, with a bomb load equal to the Heinkel. Long engines in line with the nose, Ju-88. There then goes the first round, to prepare the way before the fighters and dive bombers sail in. Now for the second phase. The fighters and dive bombers have the stage. There go the 109. And here the 110. 109s with their square wingtips and slender fuselage. 110s with leading nose, wide tapering wings and double tail fins. Now for that vulture-like plane with the cranked wings, the enormous radiator and the spatted wheels. Long nose, tapered wings, squared-off tailplane, Ju-87B, the Stuka. Tearing through the sky, close on the heels of the bomber formations. Soon they'll come screaming down with roar of bomb, chatter of machine gun and shriek of siren, in the fond hope that the noise of the attack will disorganize what may remain of the defense, and so pave the way for the third phase, the descent of the paratroops. Curtain up on the next act, the best-known troop and paratroop carrying plane, the only normal three-engine one in use, the Ju-52. See those broad, straight-edged wings, and that gap between aileron and trailing edge, Ju-52 without a doubt. There go a dozen tough guys, the out-and-out gangsters of total war. Schmeling? I shouldn't wonder. The paratroops take off, dropping from 200 to 400 feet. An easy target because you knew the wisdom of standing up to that dive bombing phase. But remember to have your respirator on tap. These fellows are liable to carry tear gas bombs, which they may throw down as they descend to deal with any of our chaps who may be waiting for them. Yet while your attention is riveted on their extermination, never forget the silent, stealthy approach of the glider, 3 in tow by a Ju-52, and carrying some 20 men silently to earth behind your very back. Close on the paratroops, the Ju-52s land air landing troops. Specially trained in emplaning and deplaning, they land some 16 men from each plane to take over from the paratroops, consolidate the position gained, and prepare the airfields for the occupation of the Luftwaffe. Hello, what's this? 4 radial engines, that arrowhead as wings sweep sharply back, that fat fuselage, the Ju-90. Speed, 130 miles an hour. Here then come tanks, 3 3-tonners perhaps, or 1 8-tonner. This is the completed occupation. Look then to the sky. Think of the enemy above you. Rule out fighter defense and he can spy out the land, multiply the speed of armies, surprise, supply, reinforce, and even occupy. This is his fondest hope. Yet the RAF will be there, mixing it with the Hun. And it'll be left to the few who escape their attack to carry out this carefully worked-out program. How far it can come unstuck you will see if you think back along these lines. Paratroops are extremely vulnerable in the air, and more especially on land. In the air, fire at their feet, that makes the best aiming mark. But if they should land, nab them quick before they can reach the containers which hold their automatic weapons. Thus they can well be dealt with, because you faced up to these. Their aim, remember, is moral rather than physical. they do remarkably little damage, and if you stand your ground, you'll quickly realize how vulnerable they are to your rifles and your light automatics. Remember, low-flying aircraft are money for old rope. They're extremely vulnerable if fire is properly controlled and the fences well concealed. So you see, you've got them all along the line. If your instant recognition of the enemy above you and your application of the several weapons you have has wrecked and blasted him from his purpose and kept intact your defenses against airborne invasion. Our RAF will in fact take heavy toll before the enemy reaches his objective. But such enemy planes as elude them are up to you. Know your enemy. Spot him in the air the moment you see him. Study him as the batsman studies the bowler. And when you've sized him up, then hit him for 6. Come the 3 corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rule. If England to itself do rest but true.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.